Thank you, Don, and thank you all for coming. Welcome here. Can everybody hear me?
A little closer.
Let's raise that up a little bit.
Raise it up.
Is that better? How's that? Better?
Yes.
Well, I think I'm going to start out by reading the foreword of the book, which will serve both as an introduction to the book and also tell a little bit about myself. West central Minnesota, not far from the Dakota Flatlands, is an area of centrally undulating land generously sprinkled with lakes and ponds, the residue and meltwater of the last receding glacier. These rolling hills are covered with prairie grasses and seasonal wildflowers intermingled with dead stands of scrubby bur oak, box elder, and other hardwoods. My widowed grandmother lived in this land with her two brothers, the proverbial Norwegian bachelor farmer type. I visited their farm often as a boy and spent weeks there during the summer. Left alone with my imagination, I found adventure wandering around the ponds and hilly pastures. Sometimes I'd climb the rampart bales of a haystack fortress to look over a patchwork realm of fields, farms, ponds, and woods that extended to the horizon. In the distance were church steeples pointing the way to heaven through the treetops. Little rural churches with names like Vang, Tingvoll, Kongsvinger, Årdal, and Stavanger. Each church watched over a flock of simple white gravestones, like a hen protecting its brood. On many of the stones, a starkly simple epitaph in Norwegian reads, "Takk for alt." Thanks for everything. This area of Minnesota was settled predominantly by Norwegian immigrants in the mid to late 1800s. Typically, they were farmers and laborers familiar with making their living on the land. They were hardy people accustomed to extremes in weather in their homeland, thus suited for the Minnesota climate. With few exceptions, they were generally quiet and conservative folks, even somewhat self-effacing. In dealings or relationships with others, they tended to be non-confrontational, avoiding conflict as though it were an embarrassment. Life afforded them a droll sense of humor, arid and understated, which usually required some time for an outsider to understand or appreciate. Generally not inclined to follow impulses, they preferred to consider things before making a decision. Decision-making itself could be an involved process, but once reached, it would be followed up with deliberate, thorough action. Sometimes consideration was marked by thoughtful pauses in conversation, punctuated by the simple word, "ja," spoken soft as a whisper while inhaling, like breathing the word. Spoken this way, itself doesn't necessarily suggest any sort of affirmation, though it could. Among these people, it was more a subconscious mannerism of speech. The broad implications ranged from insignificant to profound, and one could never be certain of which. The inhaled might express anything from a shift in thought to the summing up of an entire philosophy, or it might simply mean that one's thoughts were temporarily on hold. It was a marvelous colloquialism which through timely insertion was capable of filling uncomfortable gaps in speech. Gaps which left unchecked might otherwise expand into ponderous voids in conversation. Quiet life on the little farms was routine, and people were prone to be skeptical of anyone new or that which might seem spontaneous. But then skepticism may be just a cautious form of deliberate consideration. These Nordic immigrants probably learned a tradition of caution from treacherous mountain environment of their old homeland or the harsh North Sea. According to legend, the old Norse god Odin sacrificed an eye to gain wisdom. From his wisdom expressed in the Havamal came sayings like, "Trust no ice till it's crossed, no sword before it's tested, no maid before marriage, no ale till it's drunk." Perhaps this sort of skepticism was passed on in the genes. Throughout my life, I have heard occasional references to Stoic Scandinavians, usually in a somewhat disparaging way. These references suggest that one who is Stoic is undemonstrative, devoid of sentiment or feeling. Such traits may exist in Nordic people as they may in other nationalities, but Stoicism by definition is an acquired trait, not an inborn one. An indifferent man lacks interest in a situation. An impassive man lacks feeling, but a stoic man exercises control. He has feelings or sentiments, but has learned to restrain them. For example, take the old reference to the Norwegian farmer who loved his wife so much it was all he could do to keep from telling her. Now the irony and humor are wrapped in the subtle wording of that statement. I am not a Stoic. I was not raised in that discipline. I'm a baby boomer. My parents' generation, growing up in the Great Depression and struggling through World War II, seems to be the last generation in this country to experience severe and almost universal hardship and sacrifice. Perhaps they were the last generation of Stoics in this country. Blue Harvest is about the children of those who immigrated here, who inherited their parents' struggles, their spirit, and humanity. It is a story about rural Minnesota during the late 1930s, at the end of the Great Depression, and just prior to America's entry into World War II. It is a story about living with life's ever-present injustices. It is a story filled with spirituality, moving like the breeze, and ever-present in the lives of the characters, their situations and events. It is the love story of a late blooming mature love and our human need for someone else, along with the reassurance that it is never too late. The story, events, and characters are entirely fictional, but based on stories, personal observations, and memories of people I fondly recall from my childhood. They were a rich part of my formative years, and their endearing character remains a strong influence in my life. Talk for alt. So that is kind of an introduction to what the book is about. It is a love story, but it's more than that. It tries to educate somewhat about what it was like in that part of the country, which is not unlike what it was in other parts of the country in the Depression. But we weren't really part of the Dust Bowl here in Minnesota. Yes, there was drought, but it wasn't as bad as they had it in some parts. Nevertheless, I heard stories about the impoverished people there, the people who couldn't find work, farmers were actually a little bit lucky, because if they could hang on to their farm, they could at least grow food. And a lot of people sought help on farms just so they could be fed. They'd work for nothing but some food. So I'm a native Minnesotan. I was born in Fergus Falls, west central Minnesota. And I love my Norwegian heritage. I was taught to love it as a child, and being immersed in it with my grandmother and her two brothers, and my mother, who that was her first language until she went off and started school. First grade is where she learned English. And so I was around that language all the time. And my grandmother, I asked her to teach me. No, we're Americans, now you speak English. But it was odd to me that every now and then, especially around Christmas time, my mother and my grandmother, they were always talking Norwegian. I was so curious. I'm sure that a lot of you, when you read this book, you will recollect similar experiences. This is not unique here in this part of the country, but hopefully it will remind you of things that you maybe went through yourselves, and maybe just reflect on them a little bit. As I mentioned in the foreword there, this little white frame church down the road from the Torgerson Brothers farm is ubiquitous out there. They're everywhere. I remember my dad saying there was a church in Fergus Falls called the First English Lutheran Church. And it was simply because it was the first church in Fergus Falls that gave the sermon in English. Norwegian was considered the language of the Lord. Now, I don't know what else. Maybe it's time that if you want, I can read some more, or if you want to ask questions, that's fine too. Read? All right. I'm going to introduce you in chapter 2 to the main character. Well, there's two main characters, but the first main character, I'm going to introduce you to Oscar. The fresh scent of cow manure on mild breezes announced the return of spring in rural west central Minnesota, just as surely as the return of longer days in robins. But restless farmers here are more attuned to the subtle scent of the awakening earth around the rolling countryside. The soil and wet fields begin to breathe again after months of frozen slumber. Soon these men would be back cultivating their fields, preparing the earth, planting, repeating the annual rituals that still mark the seasons of life on the land. Oscar Halverson was one of those who worked this land, and the land in return had left its mark on him. Just over 6 feet tall in his younger years, his shoulders now stooped from a life of labor. At 60, he was still fit and agile from the physical demands of his occupation. He plodded soft stubble fields with a spring-kneed gait that looked a bit odd on city pavement, but covered off-road distances with steady efficiency. The elements of every season had worked their effects on his features, and Oscar's once fair Nordic complexion was perpetually dark and ruddy from too much sun. Long, deep furrows contoured his brow, and crow's feet tracked the corners of his ice-blue eyes. He dressed somewhat like a scarecrow from a farm garden, wearing worn and patched bib overalls and a faded chambray shirt. It was a cool morning and he had on a dirty old mackinaw with so much straw chaff and hayseed embedded in the wool it had become a part of the fabric. Handles of a pump pliers stuck out from one coat pocket while his fingers rolled around the few kernels of corn that always seemed to collect in the other pocket. A lifetime of farming had made Oscar's hands hard. His thick, calloused fingers, all 9 of them, possessed both crushing strength to deal with stubborn, treacherous machinery and a gentle touch for newborn calves. His background was not unlike that of many others in the area. Oscar was the oldest of 6 children, born to Halvor and Rakel Halvorsen, who had immigrated to America from Norway in the late 1800s and homesteaded in northern Minnesota. Oscar was the only child born in Norway and was only 2 when they crossed the ocean. The next child, a girl, died in infancy during an influenza epidemic. Then came 3 more boys, Nils, Jens, and William. Oscar was a good 5 years older than his next brother, and by the time they were old enough to play together, Oscar was old enough to be helping his father on the farm. It was a struggle common to everyone who homesteaded this new land, and the Halvorsen family, like others in the area, had very little but managed to get by. I'll leave off with Oscar now that you've met him, and I'll go on to Oscar's farmhand. Now in these days, if anyone was a close friend and confidant to Oscar, it was Hector, a 4-legged farmhand. Hector had known Oscar all his life. They took meals together and he knew Oscar's every mood. He understood Norwegian and had listened to Oscar's frustrated tirades on the bank or government policies throughout the Depression and shared his concern when weather threatened the crops. When Oscar was melancholy, Hector was there to comfort him. And when he rejoiced, Hector shared his joy. He stood by Oscar without judgment. But Hector was getting old and only moved in slow motion these days. In his younger years, he'd led the way every time they headed out into the fields. Now when he showed up in the field where Oscar was working, it was half an hour or so late. But Oscar didn't mind. He was glad to have company and always stopped what he was doing to say a few kind words to the old fellow. He understood arthritis was why his friend didn't move fast anymore. Hector's eyesight was going too, but he always saw what was best in Oscar. Hector's background was uncertain, but he could claim an itinerant black lab in his lineage somewhere. He wore his hair shaggier than a lab, and his face was long and narrow, with gray hair dominating his muzzle, and ears that never knew whether to point or droop. A few cockleburs had permanently embedded themselves in Hector's tail, which still wagged at the prospect of going anywhere with Oscar. Neither of them were much concerned about looks, at least not when it was just the 2 of them. All that mattered to Hector was Oscar's voice nearby, or his hand stroking or scratching somewhere. They were completely devoted to each other and perpetually together. Well, if you want me to read more, I can, but I'd like to have you read it for yourself. But is there any questions?
So Jack, you sprinkle Norwegian phrases in the book, throughout the book.
Yeah.
Now, are those from memories from your mother and grandmothers speaking, or are those common Norwegian phrases?
Well, it's just, they're just I'm just using it as he would speak, you know, it's, I don't know if it's common, he has to address.
But you remember, those are phrases you might use yourself?
What I remember is the Norwegian being spoken so commonly all over the place. Yeah, there were some things like, you know, maybe Grandma, when she was serving coffee, she'd say, "Vill du ha coffee?" And then the person would maybe, "Ja, bara en liten skvätt kanske." Which is, you know, when you have coffee, and yeah, just the best, please. Cynthia?
I'm reminded of Giants on the Earth, the harshness of, yeah, there were a lot of poor people back then, but many didn't have to face the climate that those folks in Minnesota and the Dakotas faced at the time. And so in that way, it's very similar to Giants on the Earth. But in that book, I don't recall being aware of the emotions of the people as much as in your book. And my grandfather was Norwegian. I never heard him say anything about how he felt about anything.
Yeah.
And I think that was typical. So I was surprised to see so much emotion in your book. And I just wondered how you figured out what they were thinking.
Well, the emotion probably comes from me. I was not a stoic, I was a baby boomer, as I said in the foreword, yeah.
But I found it very interesting to see the kind of the contrast between the external person who was dressed in horrible overalls and was a loner and all of that, and then he really had some very deep feelings about things, and
But he never told anyone.
yeah, but you told us.
Yeah.
Yeah, you told us.
Yeah.
So that was that was very. I don't know if that's typical. I mean, I don't know if you were to have interviewed folks back then, you would have found that was really kind of that they really had those thoughts. I never knew with my grandfather whether he didn't feel stuff or whether he just didn't talk about it. I didn't know.
Well, it's like the Norwegian farmer's wife who was complaining to her husband that he never told her that he loved her. He said, "Well, I told her that back before we got married." Yes.
Have you written other books, or is this a first?
I've self-published a few. I've written some books of poetry, but
Do your books all have a historical context? Or are they?
not necessarily. I like to tell people I worked in the advertising department of a manufacturing company for many years. And that's where I learned to write fiction. And that's what it's much easier for me to write fiction because I don't have to work so hard at looking up facts.
Another question, the first time I went into the Crossing Arts Alliance store, I knew you had another whole, I mean, I knew you as a person who was a woodworker.
Yeah.
And here I see the book by Jack Brainerd, I think there can't be more than one. Jack Kraywinkle, so how did this happen? These two really
I wish I could explain.
well-developed passions.
I wish I could explain it for you, but I've told Kay that I have to be creating something all the time, and I've got to be making something, you know. Whether it's carving, which I love to do. I used to draw and do things like that too, but carving or writing, I haven't written much for a while outside of this now. But I've written some books that are at the Crossing Arts too, some poetry books. My poetry, a lot of it rhymes, so it's not very good. Yeah, Dan?
You and I have talked a little about your characters and where they come from and how they go from idea in, to the page. And if I remember, my interpretation of what you said was they are, I think, kind of formed when they come to you. But what if they want to do things you don't want them to do? Are you allowed? How much? Talk about that a little bit. That's a little deeper and a little out there. But
If they do things I don't want them to do, I can always invent a new character.
do they show up in ways you don't expect?
That's hard to explain. My characters, they emerge out of the depths in my mind, and I see them more or less. They come into focus as I'm telling a story. Does that help? And if I do something that I don't like,
Do they surprise you?
yeah, sometimes.
How so?
As the story proceeds, sometimes they might, the occasion in the plot presents itself for the character to do something that I maybe didn't think of, that I didn't expect. But that's kind of a, what do you call it? It's a happy thing for me. It's good. Whoa, that's great.
Do you have any shows focusing on teachers in where you grew up, and if they were still using Norwegian at times?
No.
When I started teaching in 1968 in Romania, the superintendent, the counselor, and the most important math teacher, when any of those meetings weren't going the way they wanted to, they'd flip over to Norwegian, and we wouldn't have a clue where that was going. That's why I'm wondering if they also did that in your book.
No, I didn't include any stories of the young boy in his classroom. I didn't enjoy school enough when I was a kid.
Jack, do you have any thoughts of writing another book,
Well,
novel?
I do have another book that many of you know Chip Borkenhagen, and I gave him a copy of this book of short stories that I self-published, and he's pretty interested in that too. We'll see what comes of that. But
Is that also with the Norwegian?
No.
No, other.
no, the name of it is North of Highway 2. And
I came up with
yes,
the
she
title.
did. God bless my wife. Because all the stories are supposed to take place in northern Minnesota, and as I explain in the foreword of that book, people from the Twin Cities
Think Brainerd is northern Minnesota.
Oh, yeah. Well, they think anything north of Anoka is. But for people who are from up north, northern Minnesota starts at Highway 2, which goes from Duluth to Grand Forks. And that's where you get into northern Minnesota. And I've noticed, since I've been away from there so long, that a lot of times I can detect, I've got a good ear for accents. And I can detect a slight difference in the way they talk. I don't know what it is. I wouldn't say that it's anything to do with Scandinavian. It might be more to do with the Canadian influence, I'm not sure. But they do have a slightly different sound than people down here. Joe?
So, this book talks a lot about farming, and you said you liked to do fiction because you could make stuff up, but did you farm when you were younger? Did your family farm, or did you do much research on like the special crops, you know, that might
Yeah.
be more valuable before they're burned? Or?
That part of it, the crop, flax, which is pictured on the cover, I'm glad you brought that up. Flax around here anymore is a fairly unusual crop. But to answer your question directly, no, I wasn't brought up on a farm. I worked on a lot of different farms, and I'd help out on the farm where Grandma lived with her brothers. But that's not where I learned about flax. I was at a point in the story where I needed something to help Oscar save his farm. And that's where my dad came in, because he knew about flax. And he said the value of flax back in the 30s was worth up to 4 times what a bushel of wheat was. But you needed to have, it needed the soil to be fresh. Soil had to be it had to be, what would you call, fallow, or it wasn't used. It had to lay unused for a number of years to get the nutrients back into the soil. And then you needed to have special screens on the threshing machine. And my dad knew all of that, so he was my reference there.
The other thing I loved about your book, Jack, besides the development of the feelings through the characters, which was lovely, I thought, was your obvious, and I know that about you, your love for nature. And it was just so respectful and so, hard work. You had to do your thing the right way, and it was often frustrating, but that just came through so well, just your love of nature and how you were your characters were so at peace with them.
Thank you. Glad you recognized that. Sharon?
Back to your growing up in the Scandinavian community, can you tell us a little bit about what kind of Scandinavian foods you found at church potlucks and at your on your grandma's table?
Well, mostly they were American foods, but sometimes there were things like lapskaus, which is just a stew. And of course, she made Fatima and Lefse and Julekake and
Rosettes. Rosettes.
Rosettes, yeah. Donuts, though. She made the best donuts I've ever tasted. And my mom asked her for the recipe, and she just said, "What? You just take some of this and some of that?"
Yeah.
My mom worked at it for years, and she came close, but it wasn't quite the same. Maybe it was her cooking oils had gone rancid, and that added a particular. I don't know. Any other questions?
I just have a comment when you were reading, and just a very short part of Hector and the connection that they had. And if that's through the entire book, as people get older and have pets, you could feel that connection, which when you have a pet, you have that connection like no other. And so your way of writing about that. And is Hector through the whole book? Is he connected?
You'll have to read the book.
But it was just sitting here for that short period of time. You could feel that connection with his pal, like no other connection. Which, like I said, I think as we get older, and if you have a pet, you don't have a connection with your kids or your husband. There's just a different.
And every farm has to have a dog. Anyone else? Anybody want me to read something else?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. I know.
Read about the widow lady.
Well, what?
The widow lady. Read about the widow lady, introduced her. Okay.
I'm going to introduce you to the other main character of the book, Esther Holmbeck. Esther Holmbeck blew out the kerosene lamp over her kitchen table as sunlight poured through the east window. Diffused by curtains, the light of a new morning set the entire room aglow in a warmth that made these early hours in the kitchen her favorite time of day. She poked a couple hardwood sticks into the glowing firebox of her stove and closed the oven door. With the morning chill now gone from the room, she felt comfortable enough to remove her old sweater. Lifting a big crockery bowl down from the warming rack above the stove, she carried it to the kitchen table and she grabbed a handful of flour from a canister and tossed it on the work surface and brushed it around. Then, with a sort of reverence, Esther removed a dish towel covering the bowl, carefully withdrew a large dome of dough, and set it on the table in front of her. After rubbing a little more flour on her hands, she began the rhythmic process of kneading the ball of dough, grabbing, pulling, pushing down with the heel of her hand. It was an easy rolling movement that traveled from her waist to her upper body and down from her shoulders, ending up in the dough. She developed the motion as a child, learning to make bread at her mother's side. Every woman had a subtly different technique or rhythm for kneading that somehow imparted a personal touch to the loaf. Esther loved every phase of making bread. There was never a recipe, just a basic process that brought her a feeling of contentment, and she unconsciously hummed, "Blessed be the tie that binds," while she worked the dough. Esther Holmbeck had been a tall, slender woman in her younger days, but at 58 she didn't seem tall anymore. When young she had been pretty, but years of farm life and hard work had caused the pretty young face to recede behind a mask of age. The pretty girl's face was still there. One just had to look a little deeper to see her. Esther's hazel eyes were still bright and clear, but wire-rimmed glasses rested halfway down her delicate nose. They were now a permanent fixture. Her easy, genuine smile was her most beautiful feature. It started with a crinkling around the eyes just before the corners of her mouth spread across her radiant face. Anyone on the receiving end of her smile felt better, maybe even charmed. Esther kept her hair long, but the deep chestnut brown had turned early to pewter gray. She brushed it out every night before bed, but wore it braided and tightly rolled into a bun at the back of her head during the day. A practical woman without frills, Esther's limited wardrobe consisted of a few old floral printed house dresses, which she alternated throughout the week. Over the house dress, she usually wore 2 aprons, sometimes 3 on a weekend. That way she could quickly remove the outer service apron and always be looking proper when they cleaned the company stuff on. It's true. Esther felt, as did everyone in the area, that it was important to always present a good image, especially to strangers. Good manners and proper appearances were instilled at an early age by farming parents who had immigrated from Norway in 1870. Esther was born in this country, her parents' only child. That's why she received so much attention from her father, who showed her much of what farming was about, and her mother, who made sure that she finished high school, which was unusual in those days. Esther's mother played the organ at their church, and like kneading bread, Esther learned to play the organ at her mother's side. After high school, she helped teach children reading and writing at the country schoolhouse for a few years before moving to the nearby town of Foster Falls to work at a local mercantile store. She returned to her parents' farm often to visit, and one hot summer day during threshing season, Esther met a young man who worked on the threshing crew. His name was Carl Holmvik, and he had just got a tract of land near a country church where he was starting out farming on his own. Carl was a handsome fellow, and they took an interest in each other right from the start. The courtship went on for several years while Carl worked to get his farm established, and eventually Esther and Carl were married. She joined Carl on his farm, and through their combined efforts, the land provided, and they did well. But all that was in better times before the crash of '29 and the depression that followed. I have got one more piece I could read if you like. Okay. I explained earlier in the book that machinery and tractors are kind of new to Oscar, but he's become a little more modern. He's got a tractor, which he calls Guga, which in Norwegian just means old man. And it's kind of a slang term. But anyway, he's working on the tractor. Oscar was struggling to replace a hitch on his tractor, Guga, the temperamental iron monster he regarded with thinly veiled distrust. For the past hour, he'd been puttering to remove a seized-up bolt and had only succeeded in rounding its corners. With patience wearing thin, he now resorted to using a hammer and cold chisel on the bolt head. Straddling the hitch, hammer in one hand and chisel in the other, he bent to attack the stubborn bolt. Maybe the Holmvik woman would change her mind for a bigger percent. The second blow of the hammer glanced off the chisel, striking the base of his thumb. Oscar instantly dropped both tools. He grabbed the injured hand and spun around, gouging his shin as he stumbled over the hitch and nearly fell to the floor. Sucking air through clenched teeth until his lungs could hold no more, Oscar finally found release for his immediate pain, as well as the accumulated frustrations of the past week. In top voice, he belted out fluent verses of deadly Norwegian profanity. In metered rhythm, which, had they been properly focused, might have loosened the bolt. Hector got up and left the shed directly. Not until out of breath and bent over with his aching hand clutched between his knees did Oscar notice something blocking the light coming in the open door. He lifted his contorted face to see the widow Holmvik and her grandson, Henry, silhouetted in the doorway. The only sound was the wind blustering around the eaves of the machine shed. Oscar slowly stood upright, still holding his injured hand, still grimacing in excruciating discomfort. "What did he say, Grandma?" "What was that he said?" Henry finally asked, with his wide eyes looking up at his grandmother. "Go find the pail and bring some cold water right away," Esther told Henry. "Mr. Halverson seems to have injured himself." Now, having said his piece, Oscar was now struck completely dumb with profound embarrassment, despite his lingering pain, and could only stand looking at his neighbors in silence. Norwegian was spoke as commonly as English in this part of the country, and Esther had understood all too well what Oscar said. As a woman of the church, she disapproved of profanity in any language, though she'd heard it all before. Still, unaccustomed to such dark eloquence, she approached Oscar, still a little wide-eyed. "Let's have a look at that hand," she said quietly. Sheepishly, Oscar held out his hand like a naughty child. "Sorry, Mrs. Holmbeck, I didn't know you was there." "Let's just be glad the boy doesn't understand," Esther replied. "It doesn't look that bad to me. Can you move it?" Oscar pulled his hand back from hers and examined the red, swollen bruise with a frown, rotated his thumb a few turns, then tucked both hands into the bib of his overalls. "It'll be fine," he said, now more embarrassed that he'd even let her look at his hand. "So then, Mrs. Holmbeck, what is it that brings you here today, and the boy?" Oscar inquired, his curiosity now overcoming the previous situation. Oscar went to stand by his workbench as though he had work to do. Now it was Esther's turn to feel a bit awkward. "Well, Mr. Halverson, it was just over a week ago you visited me with a business proposal," she began. You said you wanted to plant a crop of flax on my land in exchange for 1% of the profit. And it was a good plan you had, too, as I recall," Esther continued, struggling to maintain an attitude of business advantage. "I wanted to help you, and I'm sorry I had to turn you down at the time. But, well, it was... Now it's..." Oscar picked up a bolt from the workbench and began massaging it with a filthy, oily rag, but turned to face her to show he was listening and interested in what she might have to say. "Yeah, well, you see," Esther searched for words, "things have changed since then. I just heard from my boy Arthur the other day, and I guess he won't be coming home after all." The last phrase trailed off quietly. "Anyway," she picked up again, "if you're still interested in putting a crop on my land, I suppose I could let you work that idle south 20 by the church. It'll be a fine piece of land once it's tilled."